Hey, I'm Jack.
I'm Clarissa.
We're in a crucial time in the Western Church. There are many today who say they are spiritually open and wanting to grow in their faith, but they're not interested in going to church. Scandals and infighting amongst Christians are a couple of obvious reasons for this separating of faith from a community of faith. But what if something deeper is going on? Could there be more ingrained barriers to spiritual community? For the past decade, members of our team have asked that question and have heard the following three themes repeated over and over again.
Yeah. First, our day is characterized by isolation. In recent studies, we see that the majority of people in the West claim to be lonely. Nearly 80% of young adults 18 to 24 feel lonely. We're busy and independent, often on screens, not opening our living rooms as generations did in the past. But even more shocking are the results of a study conducted by Susan Meets and the Barna Group, who found that there is an almost indistinguishable difference between unchurched people and churchgoers in their experience of loneliness. Our forms of discipleship often tend toward independent growth, and our forms of gathering can leave us feeling lost in a crowd sometimes. Underneath, there is a deep hunger for belonging.
Second, we're in a day filled with information. Today, we have greater access to information than ever before. According to Buckminster Fuller, in 1900, knowledge doubled every 100 years. In 1945, knowledge was doubling every 25 years, but today, knowledge is doubling every 12 months and will soon approach a doubling rate of every 12 hours. It's a lot of information. And the same is true in the church. We have access to sermons and podcasts from the best teachers in our day, and for some of us, the pursuit of knowledge about God is often our highest goal. And don't get me wrong, I love reading books and listening to sermons as much as the next person, but our generation needs more than just to know about God. We need to fully experience the power of a life with God.
Yeah. Third, we are a culture that is built around being spectators. We sit in the stands to cheer on our favorite sports teams. We spend time watching influencers bake new dishes, get in shape, build new houses. Even in the church, with the way we've built our current modes of gathering, we can find ourselves as passive participants watching and not participating. I've been a worship leader for the past 15 years in a lot of different spaces, some which included big stages, lots of crowds, but there is something incredibly unique about singing alongside imperfect people in an imperfect space. It's because there's a hunger to participate in His mission, to use our gifts even imperfectly. There's a hunger for the sort of culture where everybody gets to play.
So here we are in this moment in time, and we have an opportunity to create shifts in the way we cultivate communities.
Yeah.
But you might be asking yourself, are we even allowed to think creatively about the way we gather?
So this is a question that I've thought about since college. I had a strong church background growing up, but it was really the ministry I was a part of in college where I experienced the most growth in my faith. And in that season, we had a small community and we were growing together, mainly outside the church walls, and for whatever reason, that was part of why it felt so real to me. But I remember sitting on my mentor's living room floor, crying about an issue I was having, and then also having so much fun hanging around bonfires, singing with people, playing guitars. I'd never been more hungry to read scripture. And it was in that time that I learned that God does speak, and I knew He was speaking to me. And I began to live a life of prayer alongside friends that became like family. It was organic, it was exciting and adventurous and spirit-filled. And while we were devoted to Christ, it felt free. So decades later, I was leading in a megachurch and I loved it. But somewhere in the middle of planning multiple programs a week, I began longing for the culture that we experienced in those college days. And I wondered, is that a culture that is reserved for young people and then we just age out? Or is that a culture reserved for ministries outside the church, but it can't be the culture of the local church? And these questions have followed me ever since.
I have led in a traditional pastoral role in a conventional church, and of course God is at work there in all the churches. I have no doubt about that, and I thank God for the churches that I served in, and I learned a lot there and received much blessing. But I also became disillusioned with ministry, or how ministry was understood and practiced there. One guy had to produce the majority of the material, care for the needs of the congregation. You were expected to have an answer to every question and a view on every doctrine. And I was a young man with a young family, producing 3 sermons a week, visiting the sick and hospitalized. And I eventually hit a stress wall. And during a period off work under doctor's orders, I started to question if this was really what ministry meant to be. A year or 2 later, I left the pastoral position to pursue a journey of what Spirit-led ministry actually looks like. And so fast forward 15 years or so, and during lockdown, when most churches in the country were shut down, I started to question, what is the church?
Well, that's around the time that you and I met. And actually, we both started to have church in our homes in that season. You and your family in your house in Northern Ireland, and me and my family and ours in the US. And we started also connecting with others that desired a similar culture, a smaller expression, whether that is a community or a house church. So as we continued to ask, what is the church? We began to do research in 2 places. And one is the early church, and the other one is the church across the world where Christianity is actually growing the fastest. So it's been so helpful to look at the way Jesus lived his life. You know, he could have come to earth and started his church today with the internet and the latest marketing capabilities. But he came actually before these things were available. And he modeled for us instead a life of deep investment into a small group of people. Jesus cared about the whole world and reaching the whole world, but he didn't invest in the whole world or even his whole city. After spending plenty of time in solitude with his Father, he invested his life into 12 people, mainly fishermen, and spent most of his time with only these 3, Peter, James, and John. Scholars believe he spent over 80% of his time with his disciples, a small but powerful community of 12 ordinary people. And they didn't just stay in the temple, but they were in homes and in boats, and they were around fires. And Jesus didn't just preach sermons to them all the time. He invited them into real conversations, and they walked and they talked and they ate meals, and they actually practiced their faith together.
Yeah, and then he charged those followers to do the same. So when the church started, they began to gather as networks of families and homes in the community, coming together around the presence of Jesus through worship, scripture, prayer, and communion, caring for one another along the way. And these were often small, simple gatherings of family, neighbors, work colleagues, whose relationship with each other was based on their relationship with the Father through Jesus. And the Holy Spirit moved wonderfully, miraculously, empowering these everyday, ordinary people with supernatural abilities. Where is that original, simple, family-oriented, spirit-filled, miraculous community that we see in the New Testament? We began to wonder, is it possible today to rediscover communities who simply gather around the presence of Jesus and love each other like family?
Yeah, so we've talked a lot now about the early church, but as we said, the other place that's helping inform a new way forward for us is the church across the world, where Christianity is growing the fastest. So did you know that though the church is in decline in the West, that it's actually growing worldwide? Lifeway Research did a Status of Global Christianity report that shows that the fastest growing areas for Christianity are in what's called the majority world, particularly Asia and Africa. And Iran also has one of the fastest growing movements in the church today. So this is so interesting because in many of these areas there are few or no seminaries or church buildings, no budgets, no ability to have nonprofit status, but the church is growing rapidly through these small, powerful communities centered around the presence of Jesus, many forming loose relational networks. Now, persecution in some of these areas means the church has had to stay decentralized and nimble, but God has used this limitation in these countries to show us what is possible. So many of the people in these countries aren't learning from the ways of the church in the West anymore. Could it possibly be time for many of us in the West to humble ourselves and become students of the ways of the church across the world? We think so.
My name is Charlie Atikonda, and I am from Malawi. Malawi is in the southern part of Africa. And I'm currently serving as a volunteer missionary in Thailand. The far that I have come from and where I have been right now and teaching the same to other people across Africa and as well as in Thailand, I have seen God working in many beautiful ways, in amazing ways, through ordinary people, through people who felt like the call was meant or is meant for special qualified people. And I have seen that, and this is not only, does not come to the effect of multiplication of believers, like numerically. It is not only about that, but that helps the believer themselves to grow spiritually as well. Because now their eyes and ears are tuned to the voice and the face of God. Because they know, okay, I have the call. Definitely God is calling me. Which role does He want me to play? But if they feel like this call is, or serving God is meant for special people, they shut off their ears. They don't even listen to God's call because they're like, oh, there are already people who have been called by God and they have a special call. We are just the followers. We are just going to be there. But when they know that God has called each and every individual to play a specific role in fulfilling the Great Commission, they are attuned themselves. Their ears are tuned to the voice of God. What is God speaking to me? What does He want? What role does He want me to play? And they they begin to walk in that process of listening to God and walking with God, because that helps them to grow in the intimate relationship with God.
So as we research both back in time to early church communities and also across the world to where the church is growing today, there's something about these two examples that are the same. They're both characterized by networks of small but powerful, multiplying communities that are centered around the presence of Jesus. And they give us some real-life examples of some of the shifts that we can make in the ways that we gather.
First, we can make a shift from isolation to family. The answer to our isolation might not be something that we have to do, but might change who we are called to be. We can remember that the church was not founded as an institution, but it was described in the New Testament as a family. For some of us, family can be a challenging concept and might require a more compelling vision for what a family can be. For me, growing up in a Hispanic family, a large part of our culture was to gather together, to celebrate life with our extended family, to share in our highs and lows with multiple generations, and to be real with each other. In the same way, we can follow Jesus' method of investing deeply in a small group of people, inviting people into our living rooms and our lives. We can embrace simplicity as we pursue a relational and low-tech way of gathering in homes. Remembering we don't have to change the whole world at once. We can form a simple community, setting the stage for it to be tight-knit and authentic. This is the remedy to the individualism and loneliness of our day.
And second, we can make a shift from information to transformation. In a world with access to all kinds of teaching and information, we recognize that we could learn it all, but still not know God. Pretend for a moment that you had a child who wanted to learn to play the piano. What would you think if you asked your child after months of lessons to play a piece and she said, "Oh no, I can't do that. I haven't touched a piano yet. My teacher has taught me a lot about music theory, has taught me all the parts of a piano, and has even given me books to read on the piano, but I've never played." If this was your child, you would probably be looking for another piano teacher, because instruments are meant to be experienced. Yes, there is information that one must receive, but if someone wants to be transformed into a musician, she must experience the instrument. And our life with God isn't much different. While we devote ourselves to learning the scriptures, we intentionally invite the Spirit to bring power and life to the Word so that our lives might be transformed. And we won't be content with gaining secondhand knowledge. Instead, we will seek to experience God's presence firsthand through the Word and Spirit so that our lives actually look more like the life of Jesus, full of love.
Third, we can shift from a culture of spectators to participants. In a church culture that tends to lean on a few professional people to lead, we want to activate the ordinary person. We can help identify gifts in each other, knowing we experience the presence of God more tangibly when all our gifts are on display. We can follow Jesus' strategy of involving his disciples in conversation-based and practice-based learning. We can keep our forms and practices simple so that anyone can replicate them. We create a culture where everybody plays. We begin to imagine what it looks like to radically participate in God's mission with him. It's not flashy, right? It's not perfect, but for some in our day, it might be a side door into the church in a day when many aren't compelled to even enter through the front door. The change is slow at first, one life at a time.
Several years ago, I was feeling disillusioned by some experiences I had in various churches, really feeling isolated and alone. My wife and I had always dreamed of having a rich community where there was honesty and intimacy, but also a space to share our struggles and the various hardships that life threw at us. But that more and more felt like an ideal that certain people could have, but it didn't feel like it was in our future. But thankfully, it wasn't long before the Spirit kind of restored my vision of what real community looked like. And in the face of a church culture that is increasingly fast-paced and programmatic, we ended up helping launch a house church that was focused around a neighborhood, in a house, but more importantly, at a table. And for the first time, I really asked myself, what would it be like if we did ministry like Jesus did? House to house, person to person, sitting across the table. And at our gatherings, we would gather around our table and we shared lots of laughs and high times, but also around that table, we shared hardships. And the result was beautiful. There, in that neighborhood, in that home, we began to experience what it means to be transformed at the pace that Jesus created us to do it. A little bit slow, but intentional and authentic. See, it was there in that space that when we allow Jesus to invade the most ordinary parts of our lives, we get to understand Jesus' humanity. While it's good to have an exalted view of who Jesus is, rightfully so, we shouldn't forget that he was human. Because when we allow him to come into those ordinary spaces, we really get to understand that part of the reason Jesus became human was so that he could do just that, transform the ordinary into a participation with God himself. And it was in that space that once we reckoned with that idea, that living room began to feel like a sanctuary. That dining room table began to feel like an altar. And we really began to experience being transformed into the image of God's Son. But it was slow, and it was intentional, and it was authentic.
How can ordinary people help bring new life to the church in our day? We can all cultivate new communities around the presence of Jesus. Some of them will fizzle out, some will grow, and some will become house churches that then over time form thriving networks of house churches. We don't want to have to wait for people to come to us, but we can find a small band of believers, a support, and go with the love of Christ into the living rooms and neighborhoods around us. Is it possible to belong to a church that feels like home? Maybe it will be when the church comes home. The oldest form of church might just become the new wineskin for a current outpouring in this generation.
Our pathway gives you all the tools and guides you'll need to help you along the way. In step 1, you'll begin by cultivating a community where everyone takes ownership. So start by having a simple meal and use our foundational guide, the Gathering Guide, to shape your weekly gathering. This is a simple guide that can be used by anyone desiring to start a community around the presence of Jesus, according to the 3 shifts you've been hearing about. And it's inspired by some guides being used today in Africa and in Asia. You might decide to stay at step 1, and that's great, but after a season of prayer and a time of acclimating to a new way of gathering, you might decide to become a house church. You'll then lead your group through our house church guide and add a few more tools from the toolbox, building your own experience as you respond to the specific needs of your context. The 3rd step of our pathway is the multiply step. The way we stay simple is by committing to stay small. So as we grow, we multiply into other small but relationally connected expressions, an extended family of sorts. And then the Multiply Guide will help you and your community have a vision for this. You can keep accessing tools from the toolbox as you see how you and your community want to grow.
The oldest form of church could become the new wineskin for a current outpouring in this generation. Jesus is building his church, but his plan has always been to use the people he created. So whether you're looking to simply cultivate a community, or if you're looking to become a house church that multiplies across your city, we would love to help you become part of this new and also old thing that God is doing on the earth. We aren't saying it will be easy, but we can do it together, forming a relational network that shares ideas and tools along the way. Ordinary people can shape the church today, one living room at a time, especially when we do it together.